While in Casper, we visited the National Historic Trail Center to learn about the lynching of early Wyoming settlers Jim Averill and Ella Watson, as featured in the book Devil's Gate, Owning the Land, Owning the Story, by author and historian Tom Rea.
I wrote this book, came out some years ago, called Devil's Gate, Owning the Land, Owning the Story. Devil's Gate is a landmark on the Oregon Trail about 60 miles southwest of here. I first got interested in that country actually when I was working for the newspaper, and they sent me out there to do a feature on the BLM, as a matter of fact, and how they were treating the land. And I learned about a huge ranch out there. It's now in smaller pieces, but at that time, this is 25 years ago, that ranch covered maybe 500,000 acres or more. And I thought, someday, wouldn't it be interesting to do a book that tracked closely how a ranch this size got put together over time and what that said about the West. And that was the main idea that eventually turned into this book. That plus a lot of Mormon-related, Latter-day Saints-related events which happened out there in pioneer times. And more recently, when the Mormon Church wanted to buy some public land out there and the controversy that arose around that. So the book is a history of the Sweetwater Valley in central Wyoming and a lot of different things that happened there. It's called Owning the Land, Owning the Story, because what it's really about is how the people who own the land get to tell the story about what happened on that land. And so that's what, and this story I'm going to tell you tonight goes right to the heart of that question. And this is about the lynching of Jim Averill and Ella Watson in July of 1889 near the Sweetwater River. I'm going to read you an article that I wrote about this. This is also a longer chapter in my book. So what I'm going to read you tonight is a much more condensed version of what happened, and it concentrates on the newspaper coverage of the event. So after I wrote the book, I got to learn more about somehow how these newspapers did it, and it struck me because some of the newspapers got it so magnificently wrong that it led to a misunderstanding of these events that was not cleared up until about 100 years afterwards. So that's what this is about. Does that sound interesting? What do you think? Okay, good. All right. On Saturday, July 20th, 1889, 11 months before Wyoming became a state, a woman and a man were hanged from a pine tree in a gulch in the central part of the territory, not far from the Sweetwater River. The woman and the man were homesteaders. The 6 men who lynched them were cattlemen. News stories about the hanging ran in the Cheyenne and Laramie papers just a few days afterwards. But the news didn't stop there. Similar stories ran in Denver, Omaha, Chicago, and New York. The stories had only a few details consistently right. A man and a woman were hanged near the Sweetwater River on July 20th. Almost all the other so-called facts printed in these versions, who the victims were, who the lynchers were, exactly where the hanging took place, and especially why it happened, were wrong. And that was the way the lynchers wanted it. They wanted word to get out as a warning, and they never tried to hide their participation in the deed, but they were circumspect about their motives. Over the next several weeks, 2 newspapers closer to the event, the Casper Weekly Mail and, in Rawlins, Wyoming territory, the Carbon County Journal, got most of the details correct. Their reporters did this by interviewing people who had seen at least part of what had happened and by interviewing others who had known the victims personally. But because of the early bad information from the Cheyenne Daily Leader, only the wrong versions became well known. These versions went out over the news wires and were quickly picked up by papers around the nation. By the 1920s, writers looking back to the events already accepted those incorrect versions as fact. Historians writing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s relied in turn on these 1920s accounts as well as the original false versions from Cheyenne. The false facts, after a while, seemed truer than ever. Finally, in the 1990s, 2 amateur history writers published books on the subject, when 2 amateur writers published books, the real characters of the hanging victims and the more complicated motives of the murderers began to come clear. These writers went back to the 1889 stories in the Casper and Rawlins papers, and they were the first to go back to the records of exactly who owned exactly what land along the Sweetwater in the 1880s. Finally, they found something like the truth. Okay? Is everybody tracking? Okay. The facts, as far as we now can tell, are these. Jim Averill, A former soldier, cook, surveyor, and rancher, built and stocked a store in the spring of 1884 where the road from Rawlins to Buffalo, Wyoming territory crossed the Sweetwater River. This was just a few miles downstream from Independence Rock, which there's a reimagining of pioneers going past Independence Rock. Also, on the east-west route of the old Oregon Trail, the famed Emigrant Road. We've got a map here. Can everybody see that map okay? You see the route of the Oregon Trail is the northernmost of those two east-west routes there. The more southerly route is the route of the Union Pacific Railroad across the southern part of the map, which was finished in 1869. Casper did not exist yet. The Rawlins to Buffalo Road was one of the main routes north from the Union Pacific Railroad to the Powder River Basin in northern Wyoming, then filling up with cattle. From the Buffalo in the northern part of the state there, down south to Rawlins in the southern part, went right through Casper, and it also went right past Jim Averill's store. The cattle business was booming. Averill's location would have been a good place to serve both traveling and local customers. He filed a claim on a quarter section, 160 acres, of land and dug an irrigation ditch. He was at various times postmaster, a notary public, and a justice of the peace. Ellen Watson, called Ella, 10 years younger than Averill, joined him on the Sweetwater in the spring of 1886. She was from Kansas, where she had married at 18 and then divorced her abusive husband 2 years later. This is Ella with her first husband, Billy Pickle. This is from the Casper College Western History Center. Averill probably met her in Rawlins. They filed that spring for a marriage license in Lander, but when they actually got married is unclear. When they actually got married is unclear. By the summer of 1889, he had a store, a house, a stable, an ice house, and chicken coop on the property. These would have been low, small, dirt-roofed, rough log buildings. The store was also a saloon. Averill would have sold socks, cartridges, bacon, flour, coffee, and whiskey. He also had a trout pond, 16 feet square. Watson and Averill filed back-to-back quarter-section land claims about 2 miles north, up Horse Creek from where it joined the Sweetwater near Jim's store. She had built one cabin, perhaps two on that land, and fenced 60 acres of pasture and owned about 50 head of cattle by the summer of 1889. She also helped Jim run the store. This is her cabin, recently surfaced photo, just in the last 2 years. That picture was taken in 1912. Now I'm going to tell you about the 6 cattlemen who were involved that day. Tom's son, the pioneer of that country, had worked as an Army scout, a hunting guide, and a prospector, and began ranching at Devil's Gate in the 1870s. Devil's Gate is about 8 miles up the Sweetwater from Averill's store. Son was French-Canadian and probably came to Wyoming about the same time the railroad did in the late 1860s. In 1883, he married a young Irish woman named Mary Hellahan. By 1889, they had 2 children. John Durbin and his brother Tom ranched up the Sweetwater from Sun. Their ranch was by far the largest on the Sweetwater. They also owned interests in meat packing plants and in a Chicago cattle marketing business. Albert Bothwell, that's him, the alpha male in that picture, the old man with a bunch of his sons and other relatives. Albert Bothwell first came to the Sweetwater Valley in the mid-1880s looking for mining, ranching, and real estate opportunities. In 1885, he acquired the 76 Ranch with its headquarters less than a mile from Averill's store, but he did not start running cattle until the summer of 1888. He had a reputation for a bad temper. That summer, Bothwell and a group of investors formed a company and founded the so-called town of Bothwell, about a mile west of Watson's cabins, and offered lots for high prices. Brochures described a town with a store, a blacksmith shop, post office, and a newspaper, the Sweetwater Chief, and indicated the railroad would soon link the Sweetwater Valley to Casper. If anyone ever finds a copy of the Sweetwater Chief, please send it to me. Robert Connor ranched a few miles up Horse Creek from Watson's and Averill's homestead claims. Robert Connor, this is the 5th guy. He was originally from eastern Pennsylvania, where his stepfather had made a fortune in the coal business. Robert Galbraith was a well-known master railroad mechanic from Rawlins and a member of the territorial legislature who visited the Sweetwater in July 1889 to buy a herd of cattle from Bothwell. Ernie McLean, who I don't have a picture of, was a cowboy who worked for John Durbin. I can tell you a little more about the cattle business at the time, what was going on. For a few years, in the early 1880s, some people made a lot of money in the cattle business in Wyoming. Soon, however, there were too many cattle. Most went unbranded, and cattle thieves, rustlers, took advantage of this confusion. Then, with so many cattle coming to market, prices began to fall. Much of the range had been badly overgrazed. Then came 1 or 2 hot, dry summers and a winter so bad it's still famous. Thousands of cattle died. Many ranchers quit, but prices stayed low and the range was still overgrazed. Cattle theft was widespread, and the belief that rustlers were seldom or never convicted circulated even more widely, though at least one scholar who tested the claim against court records found it was exaggerated. In any case, these problems made business hard for all ranchers. Nearly all the land still belonged to the government. To control the range where their cattle grazed, ranchers needed only to control the water. That is, it was necessary to own only small scraps of land with springs or creeks on them. But when people like Watson and Averill came along, fencing pastures for their small herds, digging irrigation ditches to water their gardens or building stores, it upset familiar ways of using the land. The owners of the large herds didn't like it. Bothwell approached Watson 2 or 3 times about buying her land, but she refused every time. This would have angered him. Averill was a surveyor and familiar with land law. He and Watson formally questioned the legality of some of Durbin's and Connor's land claims. Then, in February 1889, Averill wrote a letter to the Casper Weekly Mail warning people that the brand new so-called town of Bothwell was a scam, quote, just a geographical expression, he put it, without a single house. Bothwell and his investors would have been infuriated, but Averill was essentially right. The only building in Bothwell, the Carbon County Journal noted a few years later, was a, quote, shack, unquote, where its newspaper was published, the Sweetwater Chief. Bothwell and his partners needed customers to buy the expensive lots. The paper was there to advertise the town. Twice each year, ranchers got together to round up the cattle. In the spring, cowboys cut their ranchers' calves out from the rest and then branded them. In the fall, they separated the calves from the mothers and drove some to the railroad to ship to market. The spring roundup for the lower Sweetwater ended July 19, 1889, with a branding at Beulah Bell Lake, about 8 miles west of Watson's cabins on Horse Creek, on what's now the Dumbbell Ranch. Durbin, Son, and Bothwell, the bosses on that roundup, may have been talking for months about what to do about Averill and Watson. On Saturday morning, July 20th, Durbin, Son, Bothwell, Galbraith, and McLean rode east toward Horse Creek. Son was driving his buggy. The rest were on horseback. They stopped at the office of the Sweetwater Chief, where they found Connor talking with the newspaper editor. Then the 6 men rode to Watson's ranch, where they tore down her fence and let her cattle out and threatened to kill her unless she got in the buggy. She got in the buggy. They headed south toward Averill's store, but met him first, driving an empty wagon toward Casper for supplies. At gunpoint, they forced him, too, into the buggy. To stay out of sight of the store, the cattlemen took a roundabout route to the Sweetwater River and then headed west, upstream, for 2 miles. A friend of Averill's named Frank Buchanan followed them at a safe distance. Finally, they left the river and headed up a gulch in the Rocky Hills south of Independence Rock. Buchanan got close enough to see Averill and Watson standing on a large rock under a pitch pine tree. It's called a limber pine tree. Buchanan got close enough to see Averill and Watson standing on a large rock under a limber pine tree. 2 lariats had been slung over the biggest branch. A rope was around Averill's neck. Watson was trying to keep McLean from getting the other rope around her neck, too. Buchanan fired his revolver at the lynchers until he ran out of bullets. They fired back with rifles. Buchanan fled and rode as far as he could toward Casper to the ranch of a man named Haley, who rode to Casper the next morning with the news. A man and a woman, he reported, had been hanged near the Sweetwater River. Buchanan had not stayed to watch them die, but his reports proved correct when a coroner's jury found them Monday morning still hanging and cut them down. All 6 lynchers were named in the first of 2 coroner's inquests. 5 of the lynchers were charged with the crime and made bail by signing security bonds for each other. By the time a grand jury convened in October, 1 witness had died and 3 others had left the territory. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. Double lynching. Now I'm going to talk about the newspaper coverage. Double lynching ran the all capitals headline in the Cheyenne Daily Sun the Tuesday after the crime. Averill, the newspaper reported, kept a hog ranch, that is, a rural brothel. Watson, it added, was a prostitute who lived with him and is the person who recently figured in the dispatches as Cattle Kate. A much longer story in the Cheyenne Daily Leader the same day charged Averill, quote, and a virago who has been living with him as his wife, unquote, with cattle stealing. When the ranchers learned that her corral held 50 head of newly branded steers, the leader reported, they decided they had to act. At night, 10 to 20 men in this version snuck up on the cabin. Inside, Watson and Averill were playing cards and drinking whiskey. The leader stationed a man with a rifle at each window and then led a rush on the door. And the paper says, the sound of hands up sounded above the crash of glass as the rifles were leveled at the strangely assorted pair of thieves. They were hanged, said the paper, from the limb of a big cottonwood tree by the riverbank. Averill supposedly whined and begged for his life. The woman stayed defiant and, quote, died with curses on her foul lips, unquote. Among all these inaccuracies and exaggerations, perhaps most interesting are the ones surrounding Watson's name. The Sun confused her with a notorious and perhaps fictitious prostitute named Kate Maxwell of the town of Bessemer, Wyoming, west of Casper. Maxwell had figured in news stories earlier that year about the theft of money from a gambler. Though the nickname Cattle Kate was used earlier about Maxwell, there's no evidence it was ever used about Watson in her lifetime. A close reading of the story in the Daily Leader shows that it uses no name for Watson at all, nor does it call her a prostitute. A virago is just a strong, loud woman. And even though the other Cheyenne paper, The Sun, completely reversed its tone and gave a fairly factual account in a second story on July 24th, the charge that she was a prostitute and the name Cattle Kate have stuck ever since. As long as there have been crimes, criminals have tried to avoid responsibility by making it look as though the victims deserved what happened to them. This seems to have been what the cattlemen were doing. Word of the hanging, said the Daily Leader, came to Rawlins by a special courier, a rider, that would mean. From Rawlins, the news was telegraphed to George Henderson, who happened to be in the capital, Cheyenne, the paper reported. Henderson was foreman of the 71 ranch on the Sweetwater and a friend of Sun, Durbin, and Bothwell. The courier was probably Ernie McLean, Durbin's cowboy. Henderson was sympathetic with the lynchers, and his boss, years later, wrote that Henderson was partly involved. Durbin arrived in Rawlins the Sunday afternoon after the lynching, and that evening took the train to Cheyenne. This would have put him in Cheyenne Monday morning, in time to work with Henderson to make sure the papers printed a version the cattlemen liked. The result, writes Daniel Mester, the scholar who has looked most closely at these questions, was, Mester said, quote, a publicity campaign for the management of the story from that point on was nothing less, unquote. The campaign was immediately successful. Thanks to the news wires, the Cheyenne paper's version went national, with a story in the New York World the same day. 3 weeks later, the National Police Gazette, that's what you're looking at here, the National Enquirer of its time, went much farther. A blaspheming border beauty, barbarously boosted branchword, ran its headline, with a full page of dramatic illustrations of the Casper, of the capture and the gruesome death. This is also from the Casper College Western History Center, let me say. So you can see, especially in the lower right-hand corner there, you can see the victims being led to their death on horseback. You can see them hanging kind of in the center upper left. In the far upper left, you see them playing cards and drinking whiskey. And in the upper right, you see the brave vigilantes breaking down the door with the axe. News versus history. The Casper and Rawlins papers worked more slowly, and their versions, we're getting close to the end here, and their versions seem to have made little headway beyond their more limited readerships. Their reporters talked to people who knew what happened. Very soon, these two papers were claiming that land disputes, not cattle theft, were what the lynching was about. The whole affair grew out of land troubles, Averill's friend Buchanan told the Casper Weekly Mail in a story published a week after the lynching. Quote, Averill had contested the land Connors was trying to hold. He made Durbin some trouble on a final proof. Final proof is the last step before a land claim on public land can become private land. And it kept Bothwell from fencing the entire Sweetwater Valley. Averill favored the settling up of these lands in small ranches. Bothwell wanted the whole country and said that rich men did not need to obey the laws. Mester found that the land records largely support Buchanan's claims here. As for Bothwell's ambitions, in the next few years he absorbed Averill's and Watson's land claims and water ditches into his own ranch. And as so often happens, the most lurid version of the story, the one with sex in it, had the most staying power over time. Banker John Clay, George Henderson's boss on the 71, was an influential, well-connected man and a good writer. In the early 1920s, he wrote in his memoir, My Life on the Range, that Watson, quote, known as Cattle Kate, was a prostitute of the lowest type, and when Averill and a man called Buchanan were her intimates, and while Averill and a man called Buchanan were her intimates, she was common property of the cowboys for miles around. And when longtime Casper newspaperman A.J. Moakler wrote his History of Natrona County in 1922, he wrote that it was Watson, not Averill, who ran a hog ranch, that she had taken the name of Kate Maxwell, and that she was known to her friends as Cattle Kate. Later writers picked up on that version. When a University of Wyoming professor T.A. Larson first published his History of Wyoming in 1965, he was careful to separate fact from allegation. Ella Watson, who was known thereafter as Cattle Kate, was variously described as a prostitute and Averill's paramour. It was said that she accepted stolen cattle from cowboys in return for her favors. The War on Powder River, published in 1966, is a thorough, lively history of the so-called Johnson County War, when about 50 Wyoming ranchers and hired Texas gunmen invaded Johnson County in 1892 in northern Wyoming to kill rustlers. The Watson-Averill lynching enabled the later invasion, argues author Helena Huntington Smith. And she severely criticizes the Cheyenne papers. But even Smith writes, Ella was a prostitute who accepted recompense for her favors in the form of stolen yearlings and may have gotten in deeper. That is the accusation against her. Watson may have been a prostitute. There's no way to know for sure. But by the time she was hanged, all her recorded actions, taking up a homestead claim, protesting the illegal claims of her neighbors, buying a brand for her cattle, signing a political petition, and applying for a marriage license, show her as a woman who wanted to own land and be secure and who wasn't shy about her ambitions. These character traits may have been what got her killed. As Wyoming in 1889 moved that year towards statehood, the lynching must have made its women nervous, must have made everyone nervous for that matter. Here they were, living in the only territory or state that allowed women to vote. At the same time, they were living in the only territory or state where a woman was ever hanged from the branch of a tree. It's a troubling pair of facts. The papers owed it to their readers to get the facts right the first time out. Historians owe it to their readers to correct earlier Historians owe it to their readers to correct earlier errors. It's never too late to get things right. There you go. Thank you.